Well, remember, there is a great deal of anticipation. This has been a months-long campaign. Some argue that this campaign started, the 2020 campaign, Aldrin, when 2016 ended on that fateful night for Hillary Clinton in New York City 4 years ago. And so this has been a process. Donald Trump has dominated the brainwaves and the airwaves of Americans and those expats that live and work here. And the process of deciding who would be the nominee to face him on the Democratic ticket itself took many months, whittling down the number of candidates that stood in that race. Kamala Harris then tapped to be the vice presidential candidate, and here we are. Great deal of anticipation, a great deal of expectation, given how people reacted to the loss of Hillary Clinton. There are a lot of Democrats in this country that feel that a victory is the only medicine that can rectify that devastating night for them 4 years ago. But then you also have Donald Trump's fervent supporters, those that have stuck with him through thick and thin, through impeachment, through all sorts of ups and downs, coronavirus no less. They remain firmly in his corner. Remember, we've spoken many times, you and I, about that 40 to 45% of support that this president has enjoyed, come what may. And those people are what he's hoping will turn out in their numbers today. Remember, the context here as well, Aldrin, is the fact that over 110 million people have voted in this election today. This is the pandemic election, and so we saw a number of states adopt mail-in and absentee voting because of public health concerns around the coronavirus. And so many of those returns have come in even before Election Day. The final day of voting, essentially, is what November 3rd really represents. And so record numbers in New York, record numbers in Florida, in Georgia, and in many other states. The only concern tonight is the fact that you have 50 states with 50 different electoral rules. So, for example, if Florida has been able to process some of those early ballots leading up to November 3rd, whereas a state like Pennsylvania, you know, in that social media video, you spoke about Pennsylvania. Such is the attention that this state has received from both campaigns in the last 24 hours, because in Pennsylvania, they were only allowed to open mail-in ballots that might have been received days ago today. So that process of opening envelopes, stacking them up, processing before tabulating only began today. So the concern is here that if Trump and some of the earlier, Florida, and some of the earlier states go Donald Trump's way, Pennsylvania then becomes the big focus point here. But Pennsylvania could also not be that important were the Democrat to do well in places like Georgia, in Florida, in North Carolina, where the polls say he does have an edge. And he's really placed the Trump campaign on defense in what are traditionally Republican safe havens in an election. So many things to talk about. I hope I've painted a picture just to get us started here tonight.
Well, certainly a number of things that you've noted there. But first of all, let's start off with the postal votes and concerns that have already been raised by the Trump administration and also the Trump campaign. And already there are allegations of vote rigging.
Well, and it's an allegation coming from a White House and a president that enjoys a truth deficit in the United States, right? Just because you say it so doesn't make it true. And that, unfortunately, is what we have been hearing from Donald Trump, particularly due to the coronavirus and the changes you saw in a number of states in terms of accommodating a mail-in ballot for no reason. For example, in places like Pennsylvania, for the first time, voting en masse using mail-in ballot because of public health concerns. The president has erroneously stated that for some reason there is now concern around fraud, especially if counting of mail-in ballots, as will be the case in Pennsylvania, beyond election night, which is something that has happened in the past. Let's emphasize that. This is not new, that certain states count ballots days after perhaps election night. For example, military voters, people that serve in the armed forces around the world in the United States Armed Forces, they send their ballots in through the mail, and those military ballots are always, if not often, counted after election night. What happens on election night is that news networks, your ABCs, your NBCs, CNN, Fox News, they have data analysts that are looking at this election state by state and county by county. They know where Democrats live. They know where Democrats vote. They know where the Republican dominated areas are. And so what they're able to do based on the incoming returns is to say, okay, so that area has gone blue. We're still expecting that area to come in. And so we can basically call it for Donald Trump. That's what happens on election night. They make an estimation, generally accurate, about who wins the election. But the actual results are only ever certified 5 days later by the electoral authorities in the United States. So this kind of anomaly that the president is trying to talk about in terms of mail-in ballots, there are 5 states in this country, including Utah and Colorado, I believe, that only vote via mail-in ballot. That has been their system for years without any questions raised about it. So this is just a red herring of the president, who is fearing that because of mail-in ballot, you are going to see a large surge in voting. And that has been the case, right? We are expected to break records here. The last time we voted in a presidential election, 138 million people voted. This time, it's expected to exceed 150, possibly at the high end, 160 million votes. And that is a record that was set back in 1908, 112 years ago, Aldrin. And so the concern from the Republican Party, from the president in particular, is that if you see a surge in people voting, whether by mail or in person, that's not good news for the Republican Party, because high turnout in a presidential election in the United States tends to favor Democrats.
Okay, let's bring in Dr. Krista Johnson, who's an associate professor and director of the Center for African Studies at the Howard University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Johnson, good evening and welcome to this special broadcast focusing, of course, on the U.S. elections. Listening into what Sherwin Bryce had to say there, particularly focusing on the mail-in votes. Why would the president want to cast aspersions already on the credibility of these elections, taking into consideration that you have up until at least the 14th of December to have these election results declared?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's nice to be here with you all. And this is an exciting but very anxious and nervous time for us here in the United States. I would echo what Sherwin has to say. This president has really, for the past 4 years, governed really for his base and for a small minority of the American people, and has really seen himself to be president of a smaller minority of Americans, not the overall majority of us. And so it's not surprising then he's made no efforts or attempts in the past 4 years really to expand his base, to implement policies or to have a strategy that would be more encompassing and inclusive of more Americans. And so coming into this election, he understood that he had a problem because he still is relying on turnouts of this particular, small base of his in order to put him over the top again this year. And that this year is unlike 2016, when Clinton was running against him. The Democratic base was depressed and didn't vote in the numbers that we historically have. So in this year, it's going to be, I think, a different turnout. The historic turnout is going to be on both sides, I'm sure, I imagine, but it certainly is going to help the Democratic Party and Biden in particular.
Okay, so Sherwin also. Okay, no, you can go ahead, Professor.
Oh, sorry. I was also just going to say in terms of the mail-in ballots, a judge actually, and it's ironic, right? Because it's the Trump administration that has sown all these seeds of doubt in the electorate in terms of mail-in ballots and whatnot. But in addition, what he has done he has in essence compromised our U.S. postal system, and they have put in place covert or overt mechanisms whereby the mail in this country has been slowed down considerably. And so it has taken, again, an intervention on the part of a federal judge to mandate that the U.S. Postal Service today sweep a number of its postal facilities in some of the key swing states and make sure that there aren't any ballots laying around left to be delivered, because there are some states, as Sherwin mentioned, where the mail-in ballots have to be received by election day. So that's very critical.
Okay, let's bring into this conversation our U.S. correspondent, Era Spita, who's joining us from San Francisco. Era, just taking off from what the professor has just said now, if indeed the president, Donald Trump that is, does dispute the election results, what would the steps be? What would the process be? Hi, Era, are you there? Okay, we seem to have a problem there with Era. Let me put that question to Showan. Showan, what would the process then be if indeed the president does lodge a dispute around the election results?
Well, it's unclear, right? I mean, this is unfamiliar territory for a lot of us that have covered a number of these elections. You know, the president making very key remarks earlier this week about how he's going to be going into Pennsylvania, for example, with his lawyers, talking about how he was very critical of the Supreme Court decision that handed down judgments in not only Pennsylvania, but also as it relates to the tabulation of ballots in North Carolina, where they're allowed to receive ballots days after November 3rd. He says this is problematic. It's going to incite violence on the streets. I mean, just an extraordinary moment for a United States president to talk about how counting legitimate ballots in an election based on the electoral rules of a particular state and affirmed by the Supreme Court, a majority of which, now has a conservative 6-3 majority, although Amy Coney Barrett, I don't believe, was part of those decisions, so 5-3 decisions. To then talk about how violence is going to be brought, it's going to incite violence on the streets. Look, there are clear electoral laws here, and a lot of the county clerks that are handling these elections are following the letter of the law to the book. So it's unclear what the president can really do. Yes, I suppose he can raise objections, but what sort of court process, what sort of federal, statewide rulings will be made in that regard really is unclear. You know, one of the more recent reference points that we have is the process of deciding who won the election, vis-a-vis, especially in terms of, the concerns around the Florida vote in the Al Gore versus George W. Bush election of 2000. And of course, that went up to the Supreme Court, but it's unclear what the basis for the concerns would be, because if the concern from the president, as he has stated so many times, Aldrin, is that it is not within the ambit of Pennsylvania, for example, to count ballots days after the election, but it's also been affirmed by the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land. I don't see what avenue the president has legally to object.
And you now mentioned the issue around violence, and I've heard many pundits speaking about the potential of violence unfolding post the declaration of the election results. And we've also seen that in some cities, at least, some shops have taken measures to try and protect their property. How real is the threat of violence unfolding?
Well, it's as real as businesses in New York City and Chicago and Los Angeles and Miami and Washington, D.C., the White House itself, protecting it themselves in terms of boarding up their windows. The White House has put a ring of additional fencing and, that you can't even see the White House from the street, wrapping it around in an extra layer of security. So in terms of what we are seeing, in terms of the mitigation efforts that are being deployed, there is a real concern that there could be some post-election violence, but it's unclear why that would be. The only real instigator in this post-election violence appears to be coming from the president himself, that has tried to cast aspersions on the electoral process without any evidence, just because he has the bully pulpit as the president of the United States. Has the ability, therefore, to command the attention of the world's media and say whatever he chooses to say, whether borne out in truth or in fact or not. And of course, this is a president that enjoys a truth deficit across the United States. I mean, this is someone that will make fiction out of fact because that feeds into whatever political narrative and political outcome he's seeking to achieve. But in terms of what would be the trigger, in terms of, on a normal night, election results coming in from different states, you don't really get a palpable sense that anything other than the president crying foul is going to, spur people onto the streets. We also interviewed someone that warned newsrooms, the co-founder of a company, a tech-enabled company called Harken, based in Chicago. I chatted to Jennifer Brandel earlier this week, and she was warning newsrooms to take extra precautions, really to prepare for the election to go off the rails. And I asked her, what makes what points you in that direction? And she talked about how Donald Trump was the divider in chief, Aldrin. So really, I mean, I think all fingers really point to the president here in terms of whatever outcome he wants. He feels he's going to lose this election, and I think he's trying to cast aspersions so that he can then come out on election night perhaps and say, well, I won and there's a problem with the vote, without really providing any evidence.
Okay, and Dr. Johnson, that threat of violence, and also looking into the video that was posted on social media where Joe Biden's bus in Texas was followed by these supporters of Donald Trump and Democrats, and then the president coming back to say that, no, actually, they were actually trying to protect the bus.
Yes. This election season, we have seen an unprecedented efforts at voter suppression and voter intimidation on the part of the Trump administration and really the Republican Party and Republican supporters. It's been unprecedented. They have filed, I think it's more than 40 lawsuits in a host of key states, all of which are aimed at either disenfranchising voters, not counting votes, or removing polling stations, making it more difficult to vote. None of those lawsuits have been trying to ensure greater access to voting or more ease in terms of voting. There was also reports today that there are robocalls going around in several key states. I don't know. Sherwin's in New York. I know that's one of the states that's received some of these, where people there's a recording which is telling people to stay home, don't go and vote, be safe and stay home. We're seeing, as you said before, groups of Trump supporters blocking highways and intimidating, really going into communities which are tend to vote Democratic and intimidating citizens and individuals. So it's quite unprecedented. And what, as Sherwin said, what is really quite alarming and just startling is that really much of this is emanating and certainly endorsed and certainly condoned by President Trump himself.
Okay, let's try and bring in our correspondent again, Era Spitzer, into this conversation. He's joining us from San Francisco. Era, just taking off from what the Prof has spoken about now, where you are at the moment, do you find any sense of tension at all leading up to the election, and also now during the polls as well, and also considering this these accusations of voter intimidation that has been happening, and at the same time, you still have a record number turnout of voters?
Right. Well, where I am right now in Northern California, this is a heavily Democratic area. In fact, across the whole state of California, Joe Biden has been leading in the opinion polls by about 30% heading into Election Day. Also, about 10 million Californians had already voted heading into today. So the number of, that's almost half of the total number of eligible voters in the state. So the interest in the election here, well, the result is perhaps not very much in doubt. There is a tremendous concern about what is happening, especially in the rest of the country. Some of the people I've talked to today have expressed lots of concern about the potential for some sort of legal challenge from President Trump's side in the event of a close election, have also expressed some skepticism about some of the processes that Republicans have complained about. We've seen the president repeatedly talk about the potential fraudulent activity having to do with mail-in ballots. So that's really concerning to a lot of people here in California. So, I think we can be pretty sure that California's 55 electoral college votes will go to Joe Biden. I don't think his supporters here in the state are feeling very comfortable right now, especially since we don't have any sense of the results yet.
Mm-hmm. And from the people that you have spoken to, and just taking this again from what the Prof said earlier on, have you heard of anyone who has been receiving those robocalls telling people to stay away from polling stations? The
people I've spoken with today, they did not speak about any sort of disenfranchisement or intimidation or trickery that they themselves had personally experienced. California has been fairly active in trying to communicate with the residents here about all the different ways that we are able to vote. That includes, of course, voting by mail, which has been in place for quite some time now. It also includes voting early at certain polling places. And then, of course, if those things don't happen, then Californians still can show up to a polling place like this one on the actual election day. So the hope, of course, from the people who are voting and from the elections officials is that if there is that sort of misinformation surrounding voting, that the state has done at least what it can to try and counter that sort of misinformation, which they have been trying to do.
Okay, Dr. Johnson, then this also then brings in the question around an election being declared free and fair. And I wonder whether this and these accusations and allegations that we're hearing of could have an impact on those elections being declared free and fair, as well as the credibility of the polls.
Well, that's a possibility. I mean, I think that you know, as Sherwin had mentioned, we really kind of have 50 individual elections. So the states are really responsible for running the elections. And, you know, I think by and large, Pennsylvania included, all of the states have really, you know, gone to great lengths to ensure that the process is transparent and free and fair. And so I think that also what you're seeing, which is a hopeful sign in Pennsylvania, in Texas, and in other states, North Carolina, the courts are really not siding with the Republicans on a number of these issues. And it's not just the courts; these are conservative courts. So in Texas, it was the Republican legislature, even in Pennsylvania. But these are Republican, appointed judges who are saying that these are really not credible allegations. You know, the Trump administration tried to make these claims in 2016 that, the elections are rigged, and even put together a committee to investigate voter fraud, and found nothing. And so I think that there's really not a basis for that. And I think many Americans, don't believe that is the case. I don't anticipate that you're going to see a significant increase in voter fraud, this time around either. And I don't anticipate that the Trump administration is going to be successful in many of these legal claims that they may bring.
Okay, let's quickly say goodbye to our correspondent, that is Era Spitzer, who joined us from San Francisco. And as we've indicated, we'll continue giving you analysis around the U.S. elections as well as polling stations are closing. We're going to go to a quick ad break. When we come back, we unpack these record numbers of people who have gone to polling stations, but also 30 million black Americans who are now registered to vote. What does this mean for these elections? Just after this.